Hello. One of the most important models in economics, particularly in macroeconomics, is the model of aggregate supply, aggregate demand, or ASAD model. Hence, it's high time we discuss this model. Welcome to My Finance Teacher. By the end of this video, you will learn about this extremely important model, which will help you not only to understand some academic aspects of economics, but also understand the implications of a lot of the policies that are discussed on the news, the implications of these policies on employment, on price levels, on the economy in general. And of course, as the name suggests, the ASAD model is somewhat relevant to the model of supply and demand, which I'm sure you are familiar with. What we add here is the words aggregate. Just think of this as total for the whole country. Instead of looking at the supply of, say, pizza or supply of chocolate, supply of ice cream in the town, just think of aggregate supply as a supply of all the products produced in a given country. Same for aggregate demand. Think of it as the total demand for all the products in the given country. So let's jump into the details, and we're going to start with aggregate supply. As I mentioned, it's all the goods and services supplied or all the goods and services produced in a country. And if you think about it, it's actually the same as the gross domestic product or GDP, which represents basically everything that is produced domestically in the country. And most economic models use some sort of charts, use some sort of graphs to show you what's happening. And before we jump into the graphs, we have to distinguish two time frames because there are two types of aggregate supply. There is a short-run aggregate supply, and on the chart we have a separate part which stands for the long-run aggregate supply. So let's distinguish the time frames first. In the short run, whatever is the period, perhaps it's any time under 1 year, perhaps it's any time under half a year, whatever is the particular period, we define short run as some sort of time which is long enough for prices of final goods and services to be flexible. Perhaps it's several months. Within several months, it's more than enough time for the shopkeepers to change their price levels. But short run is not long enough, perhaps several months is not long enough to change the cost levels for production. For example, if this car manufacturer has long-term contracts, annual contracts with its employees, several months is perhaps not long enough for those contracts to expire and new contracts to be signed with new levels of wages. Hence, the costs of production are a little bit more fixed in the shorter term. And we define the long run as the time frame long enough, whatever it is, perhaps it's over a year, perhaps it's over 2 years, it depends on the actual industry. But in either case, the long run is the time frame that is long enough for basically all price levels and all levels of costs to be flexible. It's a time frame that is long enough for all employment contracts, for example, again, for this car manufacturer or the agricultural company, for all employment contracts to expire and new contracts to be designed with newly adjusted wages, which are, of course, parts of production costs. So, as I mentioned, we will actually have two supply curves, one for the short run and one for the long run. Let's start with the one for the short run aggregate supply curve. Similar to the supply and demand model in economics, we'll have the price level on the vertical axis. The difference here is that we're not looking at a particular market of one particular good or service. This is not a market for pizza or not a market for chocolate. This is the market for everything produced in the country. So the vertical axis does not show the price of pizza or the price of chocolate. Instead, is the general price level, which is more or less some sort of an average, some sort of an aggregate of all prices of goods and services in the country, perhaps something similar to the consumer price index. So on the vertical axis, we have the general price level, And on the horizontal axis, instead of having the actual quantity of pizza produced as we had for the simple supply-demand model, we will have the aggregate quantity of all goods and services produced on the horizontal axis. I'll denote this with the letter Y, which we often use for GDP in economics. So what we have on the vertical axis is that level of real GDP produced. And to think of how a short-run aggregate supply curve would look like, let's just start anywhere on the chart. Let's say we start somewhere here at point A, which corresponds to some given price level and given amount of GDP produced in the country. And then let's introduce some changes on the vertical axis. If price levels are rising for whatever reason, perhaps the governments are printing billions and billions and trillions of dollars, or perhaps demand is growing because a large neighboring country is buying a lot of the products from this small country. For whatever reason, let's say the price level is increasing. What do you think will be the response of the producers, of those who supply a range of goods and services, if the prices that they can sell those products are rising in the short run, but within that short run, the costs of production are more or less fixed because there's not much time for a lot of those employment contracts to be renegotiated? So this point A, while it is going to move to the upside, it's also going to move to the right side as well, because as prices are rising and the costs of production are fixed, producers, both manufacturing and agricultural producers, can increase their profits if they increase the quantity produced. Everyone increasing the quantity produced will also increase the real GDP produced in the country. Hence, this point A will move both to the upside and to the right side, moving on somewhere over here to this point B. And if I simply connect these 2 points A and B, what I will get is the curve which we'll call short-run aggregate supply curve, or SAS. Next, let's move on to the long-run aggregate supply curve. And again, let's start anywhere on the chart. Let's start with this point C, which corresponds to some given price level and some given level of real GDP. Now let's introduce some changes to the economy where the price level starts to rise. Prices are rising. What will be the response of manufacturers and agricultural producers in the country? This point C is clearly going to move upwards because the prices are rising. But is it also at the same time going to move to the left or to the right side of the chart? That is the main question here. And if you think about it, while prices are rising in the long run, those employment contracts are also renegotiated to adjust wages higher due to the inflation. Hence, both the revenues of the producers are growing as prices are increasing, and the production costs are growing at the same time. Hence, profits, the difference between revenues and production costs, are more or less fixed, meaning that there is no incentive for the producers to change the amount they are producing. What's changing is only the number of zeros on the papers in the wallet, only the number of zeros on those dollar bills. But the values of real economic indicators are simply where they are. Hence, this point C moves upwards with higher prices, but the real values on the horizontal axis don't change, giving us a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve, or LAS. And it actually stands at the long-run potential GDP of the country. Because in the long run, if you wait for long enough, if the country is experiencing a recession at the moment, if you wait for long enough, the economy will eventually grow out of the recession, reaching a long-run equilibrium. Or if currently the economy is a little bit overheated, if unemployment is unusually low and production is unusually high, that situation will also not sustain for long run. Hence, the economy with time will return to its long-run equilibrium at its potential GDP, where potential GDP is the maximum amount of GDP that is sustainable in the long run. So in the short run, perhaps higher levels of GDP can be achieved, but they are not sustainable in the long run. Think of it as you trying to prepare for the tests. Perhaps just a few days before the test, you can keep studying for 18 hours a day, but it's not sustainable in the long run. Eventually, you will return to your sustainable level of work per day. And same for the economy. In the long run, the economy comes back to that sustainable level, which we call potential GDP. Next, let's move on to the aggregate demand. And aggregate demand, total demand for everything produced in the country comes from several participants in the economy. Firstly, the households. They buy all of the consumer goods that we will denote with this letter C. Secondly, all the firms buying all the intermediate products from other firms make up the investments within this aggregate demand, which we will denote with this letter I. Investments also include households buying housing rather than consumer goods. The next participant in the economy is, of course, the government. Government expenditure, when the government buys papers, furniture, spends on other services, all of that is within this G, which stands for government expenditure. And the last participant here is the rest of the world, the foreigners. They buy our exports, X, but some of that is cancelled out by our imports, M. So X minus M over here is net exports. And the relationship between this total quantity of all the different goods and services purchased versus the general price level of all of those goods and services is a negative one. Clearly, if price levels are higher, consumers, firms, governments, and foreigners cannot afford to buy as much of all of those real goods and services. Hence, this aggregate demand curve is downward sloped. Next, let's have a look at macroeconomic equilibria. And there are actually two different macroeconomic equilibria here. One for the short run and one for the long run. Let's start with the short run macroeconomic equilibrium. Basically, that's the equilibrium between two curves, the short run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve. If currently the economy is not in equilibrium, let's say currently the price level is very high, the economy is not at its short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, then the surpluses of goods at the high price level, as you see, the aggregate demand is relatively low, whereas aggregate supply is relatively high, creating this difference between the demand and supply, creating the surplus here. These surpluses will push price level lower, bringing the economy closer to its short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. And vice versa, when price levels are too low, the aggregate supply is relatively low because the producers don't want to spend a lot of efforts producing stuff at low prices, whereas demand is very high. This shortage will push the price level higher, bringing the economy back to its short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So those are the adjustments that would bring the economy to its short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. And of course, we can also throw in some numbers here. Let's assume that the short-run aggregate supply curve is represented by this equation, P equals 80 plus 2 times Y. And aggregate demand is represented by this equation, P equals 440 minus 3 times Y. With these equations, I'm sure you can find the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, represented by this point, which corresponds to number 72 on the y-axis, meaning that the current GDP level is 72. Notice that it's not necessarily potential GDP, because in the short run, the actual GDP right now might be different from the potential level. Instead, it's the long-run equilibrium that will show us the potential GDP level. We'll talk about that soon. Coming back to the short-run equilibrium, we'll see that the price level that corresponds to this equilibrium is 224. You can find these numbers by simply solving these two equations as a system of equations. Next, let's move on to the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. And it's an equilibrium between the long-run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve. In the long run, if the economy is not at its long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, if the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium is instead somewhere else along the aggregate demand curve, we will see in a few minutes how the economy will adjust towards its long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. For now, let's just throw in some numbers for the example of the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, where the long-run aggregate supply curve is, let's say, vertical at the value of 60 for this horizontal axis, meaning that long-run aggregate supply curve is at 60 million or billion or whatever it is in real GDP, because that's what we have on the horizontal axis. Finding the equilibrium here is relatively easy. Of course, the number on the horizontal axis is 60. Throw in this 60 for y into the equation for the aggregate demand curve, you'll find that the price level is 260. If you compare this value for real GDP of 60, this is the actual potential GDP, because this is the number that corresponds to this vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. If you compare this number with the previous short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, where GDP was 72, you'll notice that temporarily the economy is actually producing more than its potential GDP. Now, finally, let's talk about the changes in the curves, the shifts in the curves, and the factors that can lead to those shifts. Starting with the changes in the aggregate demand curve. The factors that can shift the aggregate demand curve either to the right or to the left are as follows. Firstly, the expected income. If the population expects, let's say, higher incomes, they might start consuming more now in expectations of higher future incomes, shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right as the consumption increases. Similarly, expected future higher prices will push consumption higher right now before the price increases actually take place, shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right as well. Or expected future higher profits will increase current investments in expectations of higher profits in future, also pushing the aggregate demand curve to the right. Government policies such as monetary and fiscal policies, if the government prints more money, that allows the government to afford more goods and services, pushing the demand curve to the right, or simply increasing the government expenditure directly shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. And lastly, world economy. If the neighboring countries experience huge economic growth, they might buy more of our country's products, increasing net exports and shifting aggregate demand curve to the right. Next, let's have a look at the changes in the short-run aggregate supply curve. So basically here we have any factors that can change the production costs will shift the aggregate supply curve. And whenever the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts, together with it, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts as well in the same manner. We'll talk about the long-run aggregate supply curve changes together with the SAS changes in a minute. Let's first talk about the production costs. Anything that changes the production costs shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve, such as, for example, higher wages increase production costs, shifting the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left, because with higher costs, meaning with lower profits, there is less incentive to produce as much. Similarly, prices of raw materials, such as price of crude oil, for example, rising, pushes the production cost higher and decreases short-run aggregate supply curve, making the curve shift to the left. And of course, vice versa. Lastly, looking at the long-run aggregate supply curve, which corresponds to the potential GDP. And remember, there are only three factors that can affect potential GDP. the amount of labor that contributes to the GDP production, the amount of capital that is also contributing to that GDP production, and the level of available technology. Increasing the amount of labor used in the economy shifts the aggregate supply curve to the right. Same as the increasing the amount of capital, both physical and human capital, used in the economy also shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. And improvements in technology do the same. Notice here that whenever we shift the long-run aggregate supply curve in either direction, to the right or to the left, we should shift the short-run aggregate supply curve in the same direction by the same distance as well. For example, here we have both long-run aggregate supply curve and short-run aggregate supply curves shifting to the right by the same distance due to, for example, higher amount of capital available in the country over the years. So from these shifts, the original short-run macroeconomic equilibrium is at the intersection of the black short-run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve over here. And the original long-run macroeconomic equilibrium is at the intersection of the aggregate demand curve and the original black long-run aggregate supply curve over here. Now for another example of decreasing long-run aggregate supply curve. Perhaps some disaster destroyed some factories in the country, reducing the amount of physical capital, reducing the long-run aggregate supply curve, shifting the long-run aggregate supply curve to the left. Whenever we shift the long-run aggregate supply curve, we also shift the short-run aggregate supply curve in the same direction and by the same distance. Hence, the original short-run macroeconomic equilibrium is over here at the intersection of black SAS and AD. And the original long-run macroeconomic equilibrium is over here at the intersection of the black LAS and AD. The new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium is at the intersection of the AD and the new short-run aggregate supply curve over here. And the new long-run macroeconomic equilibrium is at the intersection of the AD and the new blue LAS over here. I hope this video on the basics of ASAD model helps a little. In the second video on the ASAD model, we'll see how the economy adjusts from the short run into the long run equilibrium. Bye bye.